Weeks ago, Mark touched on a very dangerous idea. For the last, not that that's anything normal, out of the ordinary, but I think for the last 3 weeks in a row, Mark has had somewhere in his sermons, but that's a sermon for another time. So today is actually one of those other times. A few weeks ago, Mark raised the idea that we in the West are actually, it appears that we're losing this battle on free speech. That the lines and the laws are getting drawn closer and closer, and it's becoming harder and harder for anybody that holds, number one, the view that God exists, and number two, the view that God actually has a say in what's right and wrong. It's getting harder and harder for us to publicly speak like that. The latest example in Australia was when Margaret Court, brilliant tennis player and great pastor in WA, and she actually spoke up and said, well, actually a marriage is between a man and a woman. And huge sections of social media and the political side were all wanting to completely erase her from history. Let's rename the court that was named after her. Let's stop the awards that come out in her name. Let's write her out of history because she dared speak against what we want the narrative to be. So today I'm actually wanting to speak on, what's the Christian perspective on free speech? How do we look at that? What does the Bible have to say on this? So I hope you brought your seatbelts because this is actually going to be a little bit of a bumpy ride. It is. There's actually going to be some challenging things in here, and it's like, that's a little bit against the grain as to what I might have been brought up with. All of the lectionary readings today address this in some way. The cornerstone verse for today is going to be out of Matthew 10, which is actually the disciples' ordination, where Jesus was instructing them, this is what you are to go and do. But we started the service with one of these lectionaries, which was Psalm 86, and that's where I'd like to start with, and we're just going to jump from there through to Jeremiah 20, through to Matthew 10, and we're going to see how people spoke for God, what the reaction from others was, and then what God did about it in each situation. And I hope we can see and we can come away from this going, God is still in control. But that doesn't let us off the hook. That's where we're going to end up with today. So let's start with Psalm 86. This is the psalm that we heard at the beginning of the service. It's a psalm where David speaks and he says, "In the day of my trouble I call on you, for you will answer me." It's a great verse that actually stuck with, and Job actually quotes this in Job 38 and says, "God, I will call on you and you will answer me." And God turns around and says, no, that's not how it's going to work this time. You're going to answer me, Job. But it was this great verse that Job picked up on. And I think it's great that even in the Bible, people were quoting the Bible. Yeah, we've got no excuse not to when they were. But anyway, back to the point of this. This is a prayer that was used by David when he felt as if he was in trouble. And he was penned, as best we can tell, towards the end of his life. And he was aware that there were numerous pressures on him. There are some in the palace that are challenging his reputation. Some of his sons are trying to usurp his power. Israel was the only real monotheistic society in that area of the world at that time. And even the surrounding nations were challenging and being challenged by Israel. So he is feeling the pressure at a national level to actually stand up for God. Now, as we know, David was an A-plus king. He was the one that relied on God the most and spoke for him the most. But even this late in his life, he says, "Turn to me and be gracious to me. Give your strength to your servant. Save the child of your serving girl. Show me a sign of your favor, so that those who hate me may see it and be put to shame. Because you, Lord, have helped me and comforted me." Now, David would write most of the Psalms. He's the author that we know the most of as far as the Psalms go. And this is the most important thing if we are to speak for God, he would constantly remind himself that God was with him. You'll sometimes hear the phrase, an audience of one. Who is the one person that actually counts, that is listening to us, that is with us all the time? It was God. He knew that who he was doing this for was God. He said, "God, you've always been with me. God, continue to be with me. God, continue to grant me your strength." When we speak out for God, we will cop blowback. We will cop it. People will push back against us. But we need to know there's an audience of one, and that is enough. That is where we get our validation from. We don't need to have 100 likes on Facebook. We don't need to have all of our friends going, "Yeah, I love that message. Yeah, that's great." No, we need to have one God saying, well done, good and faithful servant, and that is enough. And we see that all the way back here in the Psalms, in David, millennia before Jesus. He got it. So that's an encouragement for us. But secondly, and this is where the first challenge is going to come, look at how he finishes it. Show me a sign of your favour, so that those who hate me may see it, and they may be put to shame. So often we are told as Christians, oh, you need to play nice. You need to conform to the rules that we've put in place. You need to follow the narrative that we're telling, and if you disagree with that, well, then you're not being nice. You're not caring for people. Bollocks. Absolute bollocks. You look at King David, you look at Elijah, you look at Elisha, you look at Jeremiah, you look at Jonathan. Like, Jonathan, let's go ransack that camp of 30 men. Who knows, maybe God will show up. Elijah on the top of Mount Carmel. All those prophets were put to shame and destroyed. It seems to be, in the Old Testament at least, that where people of God put themselves into a position where if God didn't show up, they would be in danger and God's name would be mocked. That is exactly when God did show up. And that is exactly when his enemies were put to shame. So often when I've been speaking with people about God or about other social justice issues, whether they be homosexuality or marriage equality or any of the other hot button topics, you tend to find that your opponents don't like to play fair. Satan doesn't like to play fair. But we have the ultimate power in God, and we shouldn't be playing fair either. I don't match my strength versus somebody else. I ask God, God, come and be my strength. God, give me wisdom. God, give me guidance. Give me your words. And God, take the words away from the other person. God, if somebody is going to come in and distract, I pray that you distract them. God, if I'm going to be having a great conversation and trying to introduce somebody to you, I pray that you would get their friends out of the way so that I can have this conversation. Okay? I know when I'm down the Gold Coast, we actually train for this. We have talkers and distractors. And if somebody is having a great conversation, a great God conversation that's talking to somebody, you know what the job of the rest of the team is? It's to entertain everybody else. Okay? Because we know that distractions are going to come. We know that they're not going to play fair. We know that, oh, you're listening to those Christians. Oh, no, let's come over here. Let's go play Mario Kart. And so the rest of the team are, hey, guys, let's go and play Mario Kart. And leave Brad and somebody else alone to actually have a great conversation. Okay, we need to actually realize that it's not just us. We have God, we have the community around us to give us strength. And we ask God to constantly tip. Like the world tips everything against us. So we ask God, tip the balance back our way. God, give us your wisdom, your strength. Let us gather as a community and work together to get your word out. Let's act as a team to get free speech going and be able to speak for you. So I like to take that model from David. Always be encouraged by knowing that God is with us and God has moved with us in the past. But then ask God and other Christians to get in there and back you up and give you wisdom. And act supernaturally to actually allow the words of Christ to strike home. So then we move on to Jeremiah 20. And we see things here that have actually escalated. Just for some background that's relevant, Jeremiah was a prophet in the Old Testament, and a lot of prophets in the Old Testament, they kind of had a diplomatic immunity. They might have been popular or they might have been unpopular, but kings in the Old Testament would never go after, normally wouldn't go after them. They sort of had this diplomatic immunity. You had to at least pretend to be listening to God if you were a king of Israel. But not Jeremiah. Even within the religious and ruling circles, he was not well liked. He would actually prophesy, you will not have peace. You will be conquered by the Babylonians. These other prophets that you're listening to, they are false prophets. Just imagine how popular he was. Like a lot of Christians nowadays. That scientific study that's being produced and paid for by that political affiliation or by that university or by that, I'm going to speak against that. That ruling body who holds all the votes, I'm going to be the one that votes the other way. That's what Jeremiah was facing. Jeremiah was speaking to the inner circle, but he very much was not in the inner circle. And those that held all the power, you can guess how much power they wanted him to have. And so they persecuted him, they tried to silence him. And this is what he says towards the end of his ministry, starting chapter 20, starting from verse 7. O Lord, you've enticed me, and I was enticed. You have overpowered me, and you have prevailed. I have become a laughing stock all day long. Everybody mocks me. Whenever I speak, I must cry out, and I must shout violence and destruction. That is what would come to Israel. For the word of the Lord has become for me a reproach and derision all day long. If I say, I'll not mention him or speak any more his name, so if he was to shrink back and not speak, then within me there is something like a burning fire shut up in my bones. I am weary holding it in, and I cannot. I hear many whisperings. Terror is all around. Let's denounce him. Denounce him. All my close friends are watching and waiting for me to stumble. Perhaps he can be enticed, they say, and we can prevail against him and take our revenge on him. But the Lord is with me like a dread warrior. Therefore my persecutors will stumble and they will not prevail. They will be greatly shamed. See that theme coming back again? They will not succeed. Their eternal dishonor will never be forgotten. O Lord of hosts, you test the righteous, you see the heart and mind. Let me see your retribution upon them. For to you I have committed my cause. Sing to the Lord, praise the Lord, for he has delivered the life of the needy from the hands of the evildoers. Now again here I want to point out two areas that we learn from. You see at the start of this that from Jeremiah's point of view, God had captured him. And for us, sometimes that's okay as well. Have you ever been in a situation for God where you look at yourself and you go, why am I doing this? Who has ever been in that situation? Yeah. It's like, what in the world am I doing at 2 a.m. walking a drunk guy home? What am I doing? Why am I posting something that I know is going to get 100 people coming back and attacking me? Why am I doing that? Jeremiah was in that situation. And a lot more life-threatening than what we face here in Australia. But he knew reality. It's like, no, God has captured me. God has captured me. He's given me a vision and a purpose. And what the rest of the world says, no, I've been captured by something better. And that is enough. And I cannot stay silent. Yes, it's burning in my bones, and I'm weary trying to hold it in. Now, there's those spots in our life where we go, you ever been, you know what, I should have said something. I should have spoken up. And you miss that opportunity, and you sometimes feel as if just a little bit of you has died. I've been in that situation way too often. It just eats away at you just that little bit. And I think we should actually pray for a certain level of holy discomfort and say, God, make me more uncomfortable not speaking than I am speaking. And we are told that we're nourished by the Word of God, and I believe that can actually be as we take it in, but also as we speak it out. We're actually fed by that. And Jeremiah is a great example of that. He's painting a picture of somebody whose normal state is somebody that speaks for God no matter what the consequences and blowback is. I think that's something that we can all aspire and pray for. God, make me your spokesperson. Make it uncomfortable for me to shrink back. It makes it more and more and more. But again, we see what the world tries to do to Jeremiah. First of all, they try to entice him back, is what it says in verse 11. They try to entice him. They try to prevail against him and gang up on him. But whatever it is, whether it's sweet words to him or whether it's threats, you see their ultimate goal. They want to take revenge on him. They weren't thinking of him at all. They were thinking of holding on to their own power. They had their clique, they had their power, their circle to protect. There is an entire political movement nowadays. And it actually tries to fracture communities so it can have, this community and this community and this one and this one and this one. And if we can get enough of those together, then we'll have our way. And they always play the same card that the people in Jeremiah were. What you're saying is offensive. What you're saying we don't like. What you're saying, you can't say that. We're all saying this one thing and we've got the word of the king, so you're not allowed to say that. And so because something is unpopular, not because it's not true, but because things are unpopular, then you're not allowed to speak it. And again, we see that in the modern world again and again. Latest one, I had to Google this and it took all of 10 seconds to find the latest example. Latest example is in Canada, they've now passed free speech rules so that you can be jailed for using the wrong pronoun. So it's ridiculous. So if I stand up here and say, I'm a woman, and if you don't refer to me as a woman, that's hate speech. Sorry, you're going to jail. It's not popular. Oh, it's not true, but it's popular. It's what they want to believe. But it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I think this is why we actually keep seeing this idea of shame coming through, because we're going to actually see how Jesus deals with ideas that aren't popular but are very true, or vice versa, or rather around the other way. The world is just a mixed up place where we are being told what we are and aren't allowed to say. But we need to take solace in the fact that we've been here before. God's people have been here before. God's prophets have been here before. God's disciples have been here before. And we're here now. So how do we deal with it? Jeremiah's response, he calls on God, but this is more aggressive than what David was. He says, the Lord is with me like a dread warrior. Exactly like how it sounds, a warrior that inspires dread. He's like me like a dread warrior. Therefore my persecutors will stumble. They will not prevail. They will be greatly shamed. They will not succeed. Their eternal dishonor will never be forgotten. O Lord of hosts, you test the righteous. You see the hearts and minds. Let me see your retribution upon them. For to you I have committed my cause. I'm just going to give us an example that's a little bit off center here, but this was a nation trying to suppress the spokesperson of God and suppress God's people and stop them following him. Modern day example of that, you can actually go back to World War II. You had one nation dedicated to the destruction of another in some of the darkest days of human history, in the Holocaust. How many Jews would have been praying at that time, Lord, be with us like a dread warrior. Make our persecutors stumble, make them not prevail, greatly shame them. Do you think it's reasonable that Jews would have been praying that during that time? I think so. I think so. And you actually look at what happened. Obviously, Hitler and the Nazis were defeated. But you move forward 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's a very interesting thing what happened. All of the movies and the TV shows and the commentary that came out immediately after, you have shows like Hogan's Heroes, Let's Kill Hitler, The Producers by Mel Brooks. What were they all doing? They were all mocking Hitler and mocking the Nazis. And they were, you look at social media now, and if you were to go onto YouTube and type, Hitler into YouTube, you'd see a lot of documentaries, you'd see a lot of one-off videos, but a huge majority of them would actually be stuff poking fun at him, mocking him. There's a very famous video where it's like, 9999999, and it's like being used to sell everything from IKEA furniture through to, beach resorts or whatever. 50 years on, Hitler is mocked. The Nazis are mocked. Because people realise they don't have any power anymore. They had power for a while, but now they are rightly mocked as part of history so that people never go back there again. There's actually a power sometimes in actually bringing shame on something that stands against God and bringing shame on things that were actually never part of his plan. And I know it's a bit of an abstract example, but I thought it was actually a very relevant one. Sometimes we think that God will answer in eternity. He actually answers on this side of eternity as well. He answers prayers in this world as well as the next. Now, I will be very careful here. We shouldn't be praying, God, anybody that disagrees with me, God, anybody that disagrees with you, I pray that you would shame them. I pray that you would mock them. If you look at Jesus, you look at the early prophets in the Old Testament, what you find is when they are discussing one-on-one, when a prophet is bringing correction to King David after Bathsheba, when they're speaking one-on-one or when they're instructing the next generation, they speak with wisdom, they speak with intellect, they challenge and they push back gently and seek to educate. But when you had a group of people that were trying to hold on to power and were trying to shape the narrative such that God was the bad person, or such that you could ignore God, that is when you actually saw them turn the tables. That is when you actually had prayers like, God, shame them. God, make a mockery of them. That is when you saw that. When you saw Elijah on the top of Mount Carmel, 850 to 1 odds. And you actually find that Elijah is taunting them. It's not just, oh, shout louder. Maybe your God can't hear you. There's actually a mocking tone there. It's shout louder. Maybe your God's deaf. Maybe your God can't hear you. Maybe he's off sitting on his throne somewhere. You'll have to shout louder if you want your God to hear. There's actually a sense of mockery to people that would stand against God. I suppose in all of this I'm saying you don't actually need to take this lying down. God gave you a wit and a brain. The prophets of the Old Testament and the disciples of the New had very sharp wits when they were talking for God. Especially if you read through how Paul wrote his letters, you would see just how sharp-witted he was and how he would turn the tables repeatedly on people who stood against God. So now I've spoken of the New Testament. Let's head there. Let's turn to Matthew 10. Starting in verse 24, this has been called the ordination message, where Jesus was ordaining his disciples and sending them out. The earlier parts of Matthew 10 are very similar, repeat with warnings and promises. The promises of persecution, that family members would turn on each other because of the word. But I want to start at verse 24, because it's a reality and a promise we can hold on to. It's a difficult set of verses. It says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for a disciple to be like the teacher and the slave to be like the master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they malign those of his household? So have no fear, for nothing is covered up that will not be uncovered, and nothing secret that will not become known." It's a difficult verse for a few reasons. Number one, because elsewhere in Scripture, Jesus actually promises that the disciples would do more than he did. So how do we hold that in tension with this one, where it says a slave will never become more than his master, an apprentice will never become more than his master? Well, I was actually struggling with this, and a famous dead guy called Spurgeon, he explained this really well. He says you have to read this all together and read it as a related thought. He says, if they're going to call Jesus Satan, if they're going to call Jesus Beelzebub, do we expect that we will be treated any higher than that? Do we expect that we're going to be treated any better? If they slandered Jesus, do we think we're not going to be slandered? No. He's giving them a warning. I've said it before and I'll say it again. We follow a guy who got killed for what he said. How do we think we're going to get off any lighter? They put Jesus on a cross because he said he could forgive people. Because he said he was God. Because he said he had the powers, he had the keys to the kingdom. They put him on a cross to kill him, and what did he do while he was on the cross? He forgave the thief next to him. They just could not stop the message no matter what they tried. They couldn't shut Jesus up even as they were killing him for speaking. And Jesus here is saying, well, you're not going to get above this. It's not going to turn out better for you than it did for me. And we just need to own this. The world is going to attack us. The world is going to try and shut us up. And that just means that we're doing the right thing. But then he continues into this promise. He says, do not fear them. We are to have confidence that the truth will prevail. And Jesus, as he was a master of doing, he lifts their eyes from right now into eternity. He says, nothing that is covered will not be revealed. That which is hidden, it will be made known. Even as people try to rewrite history and silence those who speak for God and use all of their tricks to try and do so, we are assured that God hears. And I want to go back to that idea of the audience of one. God hears, and that is enough. Jesus reminds them, what I say to you in the dark, tell in the light. What you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Again, to quote Spurgeon on this, the message of Jesus was gloriously public. It was not for a secret few, not to be hidden away. There isn't one message for inside the church and one for those on the outside. Now, those on the outside may not understand, but they can hear it, and it is not to be hidden from them, is how Spurgeon would interpret these verses. So we need to become master craftsmen and women at speaking for God. You look at what Jesus did with the disciples. They went from being fishermen, unschooled, ordinary men, we are told. And yet by the time you get to Acts 2, they are boldly proclaiming, one by one here, on a lake, or at a lake, by a road, by a chariot, in jails, in synagogues, in temples, in the Roman court system. They would continue to proclaim wherever they found themselves, and they would speak. And when they were threatened, they would run. They would go to another city and spread the message there, and another message there. The Christian faith was actually spread by the persecution it received by speaking for God. It may be that as free speech is more and more and more curtailed, and as more and more persecution comes on the church, that old saying, the tighter you grip something, the more control slips through your fingers. May be what happens to the world as it attempts to choke the life out of Christianity one more time, as it always has. So that is our history and our future. Like everything in the Bible, Jesus is not asking us to do something he didn't do, and we are not facing something the disciples didn't face. Okay? Let us never think that we are facing something that others haven't faced before following God. The tools are new, but the approach is exactly the same. So I want to leave us today with a couple of real practical tips as to how we can do this. The first thing I want us to say is, don't be silenced. Never let anybody tell you, inside or outside of the church, that you aren't allowed to speak for God or for any other justice issue that God has put on your heart. Many times Christians will hide behind proof texts such as Jesus saying, "My kingdom is not of this world." And they'll avoid getting into politics, or they'll avoid speaking for contentious issues because they think, oh, God's got that under control, I'm not meant to get into politics. No. Never, never, never. Go and Google William Wilberforce if you disagree with that. Okay? I actually found out this week that somebody I knew 20 years ago, very gentle heart, is now actually a candidate for the next state elections. Okay? Passionate Christian, gentle heart. I'm following her on social media and she is giving as good as she is getting. We are not to be silenced just because we follow Christ. Second thing I want to say is learn what you are passionate about. What has God put in your heart that is burning like it was for Jeremiah? Okay? Is it, the debates around sexuality in marriage? Is it the fact that fathers are being squashed into smaller and smaller areas of life and, men really aren't needed? Is it, the cry of people in the third world? Is it refugees? Is it some political... What do you believe God has put passionately in your heart? Become an expert at that. Okay? Become an absolute expert at that. Quite often, Jesus' opponents would come to him with a question which on the surface, if you don't think too much about it, was a slam dunk for them. Now, classic example for this, but it actually hid something much darker. Classic example was when they brought the woman caught in adultery to Jesus. What should we do with her? She's obviously been caught in sin. What are we going to do with her, Jesus? You're holy. What are you going to do? Now, what's the obvious answer? She's guilty. You kill her. And I think that was about as far as his critics had actually thought through. They wanted to keep it at a very high level narrative, keep it very simple and plain. This is one fact, this is applied to her, let's kill her. And they were going to try to use that to trap Jesus. But Jesus knew what was in their hearts. Jesus knew what the true arguments were. Jesus knew the Torah and the scriptures much better than they did. And so he turned it around, and he knew that it wasn't a case of what is her guilt. It's who is innocent enough to cast the first stone, and that's how he turned it around. And they were all left ashamed. The Bible says they all sort of walked away, and when she looked up, he was the only one left. That all slinked off in shame, because they knew they weren't innocent. They had sins. They just were trying to craft the narrative so that their sins weren't focused on. It was only hers. Jesus knew his area of expertise very well, and he used that to turn it around on them. You know, as an example in modern day, let's look at, again, the marriage equality debate. At the surface, if you want to keep it at a very surface level, and I'll argue devil's advocate here, why should the government care who you marry? Man, woman, child? Why should the government care? And that's the narrative that is actually put out into social media all the time. Oh, we all love each other. Why should the government care? But if we really want to argue that point, what relationship creates the most stable families? What relationship creates the more dependable taxpayers to fund society? It's a government program. This is the government getting involved, so we need to think like taxpayers. In a world of limited resources, where should the government be subsidising relationships? What is best for the children involved here? Where are children going to learn what a respectable male and female role models are, if not in a family with a male and female parent? These are the questions that need to be asked in that debate. You don't let people hold the narrative at a very high level. You actually delve down and actually ask the searing questions. You ask the questions that they don't want to answer. We have to decide whether we believe Jack Nicholson or Jesus. I love this saying. What does Jack Nicholson say? The truth? You can't handle the truth. And what does Jesus say? The truth will set you free. So do you believe Jack, or do you believe Jesus? When it comes to free speech and what we say, we have to delve down into the truth and not keep things at a high level where people don't need to deal with the truth. Third one of 4, don't let people silence you on that surface level. The main way that they will do this, and this goes back straight to Matthew 10, where he says, they're calling me Beelzebub, they're calling me Satan. Now, if you actually read forward a bit, if you go forward to Matthew 12, you actually find the Pharisees and Sadducees accusing Jesus of being Satan. And why were they doing that? It was to try and shut him up. It was to try and to take the power away from him. Oh, he's only healing people by the power of Satan. Yeah. He's only healing people by the power of Satan, so you can't listen to him. They were trying to say, oh, you're for Satan, we're not going to listen to you. What's the modern day example? Oh, you're a homophobe. You're a racist. You're a Christian. You're uneducated. You believe in evolution. You notice in none of those are they actually attacking the facts. What they're doing is they're attacking you. Okay? And you actually looked, and Jesus completely dismantles their argument. Quite often as Christians, we're tempted, this is one of the big areas where we're tempted to fall back. Somebody says, oh, you're a homophobe. Well, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. This is one of the areas where Jesus actually went on the offensive. I've heard a couple of great speakers out of America, and people try to silence them all the time. And they turn it right around and say, defend your accusation. You are going to attack my character. I was trying to debate facts and have a discussion, and you want to attack my character? Defend your accusation. Why am I that? Put them on the defensive. You see, the Pharisees and Sadducees, they ran away. They couldn't fight Jesus because he didn't let that stand. They attacked his character. No. And they backed away. I've had a few people, and I love debating science and having discussions with people, when I'm talking to them about God, and sometimes it'd be Oh, but you're not really educated. You believe in evolution. You're not really educated. Really? Oh, you don't believe in academia. Oh, so that dual degree and that IT degree and that certificate in project management and 20 years of it. Yeah, I obviously don't believe in academia. I mean, you're obviously so much smarter than me, you grade 12er. I've had other discussions. It's like, no, Brad, your opinion doesn't matter because you're a homophobe. Oh, really? Like, so my homosexual friends that I hang out with, used to play computer games with all the time, yeah, I must really hate them. You know, because I actually love and I want children to be raised with a mother and a father. Yeah. Must really hate everybody, mustn't I? And you turn it around and you actually shame. If they are trying to shame you, they are trying to actually shut you down and paint you as somebody with no power. And we can't let that happen if we actually want our message to fly home. If they attack your character, you actually need to be bold enough to say and call it out. You're attacking my character instead of addressing the argument. Defend your accusation or get back to the argument. And quite often, many of them will actually, they've never had that happen before. And they'll actually be forced onto the defensive. And even if you don't win that person over, those that are listening will actually see the futility of the argument. They'll actually see that. Okay, and the final point here. Realize that others may not listen how you speak. If we are going to go to the bother of actually putting ourselves out there, opening ourselves up for attack, opening ourselves up that people will push back on us, we'd better actually make sure that the message can strike home. Okay? Realize that others may not listen how you speak. You look at Jesus. When he spoke to the Pharisees, he used theologically loaded language. He quoted from the Torah. He quoted from the Old Testament prophets. He argued from the point of view of Moses. But when he spoke to the Samaritan woman, he spoke of her traditions. When he spoke to the disciples, he started speaking with analogies of fishers of men. But at the end of the ministry, as they had become more educated and as he had taught them, he was addressing them with some quite complex issues which we still deal with today. To the adulteress, he spoke of not condemning her, and he spoke emotively. Paul would speak to the philosophers in their language, and then in his next book he would speak using barrack room or prison language because he was in prison. And then we see that he would go through the Roman court system and he would appeal using their courts and their rules. He was always speaking to, it's not enough just to have one message that we deliver in one way. We need to be able to speak to all of those that we come across and speak in their language so that they can understand. And we also need to recognize that if people reject us, well, people will reject us. People will reject our message. But they're rejecting Christ who is in us. And we continue praying for them. As much as I've focused on sometimes you need to turn the tables and you need to go on the offensive and you need to, if it's in a public setting when they're trying to twist your words, you can actually go back on them. Despite all of this, these are still people that are rejecting Christ and we still need to be praying for them, loving them, and praying that their lives would be transformed by the power of the word. Ultimately, our free speech is not about us winning. It's about us getting God's word out and letting him transform people's lives through that. And that's where I will leave. Keep your eyes on what is important and what's not. I've spoke a lot this morning about social justice issues because that's a lot of the area where we lose focus or where we're getting constrained in free speech. But ultimately, the church is not just a social justice movement. It's not an arm of a political party. It's not a platform for certain issues. It's not just a social club where we get together on Sunday mornings. We are about preaching Christ crucified. That is what we are about. If we were to lose the ability to speak of anything else, this is the one that we would hold on to. Romans 1:16, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for the salvation to everybody who believes. That is what we ultimately must preach. And 1 Corinthians 1:22 is where I was quoting from before. Jews demand a sign, Greeks look for wisdom. but we will preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jew and Greek, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. Now that is what we will speak. So we don't burn bridges just to win a point here or a point there. Everything that we do needs to be pushed towards and focused towards getting the message of God and his gospel to an unbelieving world. We just do so in such a way that we don't allow ourselves to be silenced and taken out of the picture. We are going to finish today with Victor's crown. Right back at the start, those psalms, they called themselves and they reminded themselves, God has always been with me. God is with me. And God will win in the end. And that's what this song actually teaches us and proclaims and reminds us. There is one person who wears the victor's crown, and that's the side we're on.